So my world is the intersection of coming to a new country and loss of press freedoms, and what does it mean for us today? And what I'll start, I'll move ahead and I'll shift back towards my childhood. But for me, one of the defining moments, I've been in this business 30 years and I've had great success. It's been a real blessing. It's like it's doing mission work. So I've had this great trajectory where I was working at the Miami Herald, from cub reporter to investigative reporter, and I was always hungry to run my own newsroom. And then the publisher told me one day, he says, "Listen, the editor of El Nuevo Herald, the Spanish paper, is retiring. Would you consider running it?" And I told David, he says, "I'll start tomorrow." And I'm thinking, this is great. I'm going to run my own newsroom. And I was taken aback by the reaction from a lot of my friends and peers who said, "Are you crazy? Why would you leave the mighty, the nickname of the Herald was Mother Herald. Why would you leave Mother Herald to run that place, man? Just it's Spanish language. No one pays attention to it. And, who cares, man? That's just not what it is." But I sort of did one of these because I knew I was in on a secret handshake, and I could see like Chrissy was mentioning, the growth and trajectory, not just in our country, but the being able to operate in two languages. But also for me, it was an opportunity to go lead coverage for a news organization that was growing exponentially on the digital space and being able to just direct news towards countries that really suffer from press freedoms, and specifically Cuba, where I was born, Venezuela, and Colombia. Colombia is a partner of ours, but there's not a lot of press freedoms at times, and without a doubt. And there's been a lot of turmoil there, and so Venezuela goes without saying, and Cuba is a clear example. So for me, it was that ability to go back and then get into a newsroom where I can impact journalism and democracy and press freedoms into countries where it's really starved. So going into my own family story, what I'll tell you is, so I was born in Cuba, and I look back now. In fact, I was yesterday visiting with my mother, Eulalia, who turned 85 years old, and she's an incredible story, my role model. So think about in your own lives here as you're watching this and listening, that think about if you're in your 50s and suddenly the police show up at your door and saying, "You have to leave this house. This is now the government's house." Well, wait a minute here. I've got my house is paid off, or I got a mortgage. No, it doesn't matter. The house it's no longer yours. You need to get out now, or we're pushing you out. So my grandparents lost everything. They had to leave with nothing. A suitcase, food's in the refrigerator, too bad. Cars in the driveway, too bad. Clothes, get what you can and get out. My parents were 23 and 24. I've got a daughter who's going to turn 23 this summer, and my mother had just had me. And so it's this mad scramble of what's going on here. Castro had come to power, and what do we do? Do they think this is going to be temporary, or is it they're going to outlast it? But it soon became reality that Castro was going to stay, and we needed to get out. Of course, I was a baby. And my grandfather was a physician who had cared for many folks during his practice. Some of them had become part of Castro's government, and but they cared about my grandfather because he had saved members of their family's lives. So they had told him, his name is Rafael. Rafael, you got to get out of here. The only reason we're having this talk with you is because of what you've done for our family, but you've got to get out. This is not going to end well. My father was part of the resistance movement, of student resistance movement. Several of his friends had been captured, detained, and summarily executed. So that was like, we got to get out. They were able to secure visas, and we left through the airport. And as we were leaving, my grandmother, this was one of her great traumatic moments of coming to this country. She told me later on was of being detained, and there was a cavity search performed on my grandmother, and then they took my diaper off to see if I had any jewelry hidden in there. And those are the little things that just never go away from you. And then coming to a new country where you don't speak the language and you have to start all over again, and just it's a vertigo that in a short period of time you have to rebuild your own life. So they managed to in their own way and become part of this great country, and always, as I got older, told me, said, never forget this country, open its doors for you, no matter whatever you can say and think about this country. No place is perfect, but at least in America, you're going to have a chance, and you work hard compared to where you were back home. So that's my family story. And then just my little sidebar, my mother, she was in medical school in Cuba, one of the first women in medical school. And she had to come in here, didn't speak the language, and she worked as a cigarette girl. And she also learned, she was a lab technician and learned English, saved all her money and went to Spain to finish medical school there, and then came back to the US and did her residency and ultimately became a physician. Between then, my parents had divorced. So really I was raised by a single mother and a very godly grandmother. So fast forward, about one of those little events that really touched you in singular moments for me was my grandmother. I didn't learn to speak English until I was 5. And then I was headed for kindergarten. And my grandmother found out through all the neighborhood ladies that, oh, there's this thing, the Pledge of Allegiance, that you have to do. And so my grandmother went and found some card and just memorized phonetically as best she could the Pledge of Allegiance. And so she taught me the Pledge of Allegiance because she didn't want me to walk into day one at Auburndale Elementary School and not be able to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So there's these little things that stand out to you. And it's just, again, it's rebuilding your life in a new country and assimilating. So I'm just very, very proud of that facet of my family's life. And looking back now, as the older I get, the more it warms my heart about just what every sacrifice that they did for me. So I live under the adage that to whom much is given, much is expected. So my goal is to give back. Now, remember I mentioned working at the El Nuevo Herald, running the newspaper there. So I end up in this incredible position where I get to report and lead coverage of my homeland. Goes back to journalism and what it's all about. But since I'm able to operate in English and Spanish very seamlessly, I'm leveraging this to tell stories of what's happening in other countries and bring those voices in what's going on. And I think about reporting in Cuba is extremely difficult. And I want all of you to know this. So Cuba would not give visas to reporters from either of the heralds, especially El Nuevo Herald. So we would have to sneak reporters in with using tourist visas, and we would have to use all kinds of methodologies to report stories from the island and bring them back. So it almost call it like journalistic spycraft. And I don't want to go into some of those details because, believe it or not, they're still in use today. But one of the great things of being able to do that is the stories that we were able to tell. Again, leveraging relationships that I had built here journalistically, we were able to do stories on, we're actually working with the Toronto Star in Canada about sex tourism from Canada to Cuba, where you had registered sex offenders who would travel to Cuba to have sex with children. And so by using our connections in my platform, we were able to tell that story, not just in the Spanish media through El Nuevo Herald, but also in Canada through the Toronto Star and through the Miami Herald. So we were able to do investigations on that. We were the first paper that reported that Hugo Chavez was dying of cancer in Venezuela. And beyond that, one of the great stories that a colleague of mine did was, of all the leaders in Cuba who had left the country, so-called communist leaders who had gone into exile, and the wealth they had accumulated, especially in the US. And so some of the key leaders in the Castro government were living in Florida, and some of them had become house flippers. So think about a communist to capitalist and flipping homes. But the bigger point for me was going back, not just telling the stories here, but how those stories connected back on the island where I was born. And the example of that for me was there was a report written in Cuba, especially when you go out to the eastern provinces away from the key cities. There's a lot of shortages so people would trade meat for a copy of El Nuevo Herald. They would trade cooking grease for copies of the newspaper. That told you the value, the thirst and hunger for independent press freedoms. And there's a city in eastern Cuba called Palma Soriano, and I received a letter. I don't know how it got out, but it got out. It took like a month or so to get to me, from a reader in Palma Soriano, and he had clipped out several pieces of El Nuevo Herald and mailed it to me and said, please continue to do the job you're doing. It's important for our people, for us to read what you're doing. So that for me, it was full circle back to my family and everything that they did to come in here. So I guess to wrap it up here, what really as a Hispanic and as a journalist and through my life experience, what I want to leave you with is that my job now is to fight for press freedoms and really be an ambassador. Again, it's a blessing to be able to operate and work with a team here at the Austin American-Statesman. But in my previous roles with USA Today, and whether it's a standards editor and so forth, but really, to use the term, speak truth to power, but also let folks know just how fragile press freedoms and democracy are. And we saw it with our last administration, and just how easily things can go sour, but also the importance of freedom of the press and giving back. And this will be very near and dear to Megan, but there's a lot of threats going on against journalists. There's always been, so I don't think this is something brand new. In 1976, there was an investigative reporter in the Arizona Republic named Don Bowles, whose legs were blown off. He was blown up and he was killed, and he died from his injuries doing an investigation. There was a journalist who I grew up really admiring in Miami named Emilio Milian. Emilio spoke truth to power on radio against exiles. And the same year as Don Bowles was blown up, Emilio Milian was blown up by a car bomb. No one was ever arrested and charged. Emilio lost both legs. He survived and went back on the radio. So what I want to leave you with is, again, support independent local news, because we are so key and important, and more important than ever. And again, for me, this is a blessing to be here, and I'm standing on the shoulders of a brave family, the Garcia family and the Setmanat family, who said they'd rather die broke in this country and start anew than to live in the tyranny of communism. And I'm living the American dream for it. So thank you.
Manny, thank you so much for your story. As the son of a Cuban refugee, a lot of your story really resonates with me. And I've heard a lot of stories about people who have fled Cuba, and that's that story that you told about, them, bodies cavity search of your grandmother, and the indignity that must have been, and then searching a diaper to see if they were, taking any jewelry out. It was just so powerful. So thank you so much for your personal story, and also for all the amazing work that you've done in your career as a journalist.
No, thank you, Daniel.
Sure. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, a storyteller, Lily.